There's no need to complicate things. Let's stick to the basics. We both know what we want. Let's just keep it.
Hey everybody, Corona Davis Diop here with Black Filmmakers Matter, and today we have the most marvelous Joe Menendez. Hey Joe.
Hello, how are you?
I'm so glad you're here, man. You got so much to teach us today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I've loved your podcast. I've listened to all of your interviews with the directors, and I think every single one of your interviews with directors is extraordinary. And hearing their stories has been eye-opening and instructive, even for me. Like I love hearing what other filmmakers are talking about.
Yes, thank you so much. And Joe, where were you raised? Let's talk about where you were raised.
Well, I was born in Washington Heights in New York. My parents are immigrants from Cuba, and I was raised in Miami, in South Florida, and this is where I've lived, until I moved to Los Angeles, and it's where I started making movies. I was one of those. I'm older, and I started making movies at a very young age in the '80s.
Okay.
I grew up, if I say working class neighborhood, it's I'm being generous. It was a very poor neighborhood.
Okay.
I was one of those that did not speak English when I got into kindergarten, so English is my second language. And but I was sort of wrapped up in movies from a very young age, and it's one of those things that I can't explain where it came from, but I got hooked on Super 8 movies at a very young age, and I started making my own little films with my brother and my cousins at a very young age, and
Okay.
it never stopped. And all through junior high and high school, this is all I did, and I became obsessed with making movies in South Florida. And when I was about 22, still in school, an opportunity came up for me to drive out to LA with a friend, and my mother, who's an immigrant, was like, "You've got to get an education." And I was like, "Mom, don't worry." And she's like, "You got to get an education. You can't go." And I was like, "Mommy, todo bien. I'm gonna,
Mommy.
I'm gonna get it. I'll finish in LA." And
Mhm.
that didn't happen because when I got to Los Angeles, I showed up to LA with like $200 in my pocket, and so I had
Okay.
to work. I had to work, and I had to find a job, and I worked at like Universal Studios as a ticket taker. I did a bunch of temp jobs. But the entire time, whatever money I made, I would make little films. I just kept making movies, and in those days it was all VHS. So
Right.
it wasn't like I'm rather envious of young filmmakers today because they got Vimeo and YouTube, and they can just like shoot a movie on their phone,
Right.
and like they could post it. In my day, it was like we were shooting on film, and like
Mhm.
you didn't know we had an exposure until you got the film back from the lab. So you're like, God, I hope that was in focus.
I
I hope
remember.
that was
Yeah.
exposed. And then you would get it, and you would like beg and borrow and steal to edit the movie, and then you would then put it on VHS tape and send it out and hope somebody liked it. And I did that for a long, long time, and eventually my short films got some attention with a reality TV show called Real Stories of the Highway Patrol. This is
Okay.
way back in the '90s, and I was basically hired at 25 to start directing reenactments.
Wow.
And so I was flown all over the
I
country
didn't
to
know
shoot.
that was a thing
Oh, it was
to
a thing. Like it
direct
was like back in the
acting.
America's Most Wanted kind of days where they were like they would reenact things, and so they would
Okay.
hire directors to do these little mini movies within the show.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
so that's how I started doing these little reenactments. They were like 5 minute, 6 minute, 7 minute reenactments within the shows. And then I ended up doing the exact same job for Telemundo. I ended up doing, and then I was in Spanish television for a very long time. And Which is an interesting thing because what happened is I went into Spanish TV and did that for a number of years while
Okay.
living in Los Angeles. The entire time I'm trying to get a foothold in Hollywood and all that. And back then in the '90s, there just weren't a whole lot of Latinos working in Hollywood. So I went off into the fringes and I went off into Spanish language television while living in Los Angeles. And I was doing all this work. And in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm doing all this work. People are going to see it. Like I'm doing all this work in Spanish television. And what I discovered when I came out on the other side of it was, and I spent, I don't know how many years, 4 or 5 years in that world in Spanish television. When I came out on the other end of it, it's like I had disappeared, because at that point, like, you're not in the general market. So as far as Hollywood's concerned, I wasn't part of the industry. I was, so I had to, it's almost like I disappeared for 5 years and they didn't know who I was. I had to reintroduce myself to the business. So I took all my Spanish language work, and I did, at that point, Telemundo had been bought by Sony in the late 90s. And so I ended up doing sitcoms. And what they did is they took all the classic sitcoms from like the 70s and they redid them in Spanish. So like we did the Jeffersons, but in Spanish. And it was a show called Los Beltran. And I got my WGA card and my DGA card on that show. So I was doing legit DGA, WGA work, but it was in Spanish. And so no one saw it. Like, I just assumed everybody was seeing it. And so I had all this stuff, all this work that I had made, but it was all in Spanish. So I subtitled it and I gave it to my then agent. And I said, well, let's send this around. And the feedback that I would get was, they would go like, yeah, we watched it. Does he speak English? Because, you know, we need to do it's English. And then like my agent would go, yeah, he was born in New York. Yeah, he speaks English. And so it took a while to then use my Spanish language stuff to finally get a foothold. And it started with Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon was doing family shows in the early 2000s. Like this was like, yeah, it was like 2000. It was the year 2000. And there was a show called The Brothers Garcia about Latino family.
I remember.
And they were looking for directors, and I went and interviewed. And there was a lot. There weren't a lot of us Latino directors at the time, and but there were enough that I was competing with, you know, a handful of them, and I knew we all knew each other. like I always say that Hollywood's a small town. Latino Hollywood is an even smaller town. Like it's just like, so we all knew each other, and thankfully I got that job, and then it just steamrolled. And then like, because what happens is the moment you get that one thing, it just starts steamroll. And like, you know, like, and that show, The Brothers Garcia, was the first time that I had done like a big show where I showed up on the first day of shooting, and it was like, oh, it's a big crew. Oh, there's a lot of stuff. Like I had been doing stuff in Spanish television, which was a little more contained.
Right.
And now it's like, oh, I'm with the big boys now. Oh, this is, you know.
Was that like really overwhelming for you, or were you ready? You were ready to go.
Well, here's what I did, and I think this is what every filmmaker should do when they get that opportunity. So at call time, the AD, as they all do, said, "All right, we're in," and she said, "All right, Joe, you have the floor," right? And this is where I'm supposed to start blocking, and I felt that all heads turned to me, and a lot of the crew guys were all like older crew guys. They've been around for a while. They're watching, and a lot of these crew guys are like, you know, I could direct better than this idiot. Like, what's this guy gonna do? Like, there's a lot of that going on, and they're like, wait, all right, go. Let me see what you got. And there was a moment, I'm not gonna lie to you, that I stopped and I looked around and I went, oh my God, this is a lot of people. And then I looked over at the actors and I said, oh, actors, this is what I do. Since I've been directing with my brother and my cousins. I talk to them, and here's the scene, and now I just work. And so you learn to tune out the noise, because if you go up at 30,000 feet and you look at what you're doing, it's overwhelming. But if you do the thing, whether you're doing a movie for $5 or you're doing a movie for $5 million, the process is identical, which is it's you, the director, talking to an actor about the scene, and you're working it out. You're like, all right, so you enter here and you sit here. Oh yeah, let's go ahead. Yeah, why don't you cross there? Yeah, why don't you grab that prop? And like, let's do that again. Can you do that faster? And you're just working with actors. And then you turn to a DP, and you're like, after the blocking, and you're like, all right, so I think we start here, and then we go here and we do that. And then you walk away, and then the noise begins, and then they start lighting and they start doing all that. And the moment you start realizing everyone's just watching you block so that they know what they got to do. You know, the lighting guys want to know what lighting, the grip need to know what dolly track to put down. Wardrobe needs to know what shirt they need to go, you know.
Right.
So if you break it down to its smallest components, it's never overwhelming, because it's the exact thing. You know, you're a filmmaker, so when you've talked to actors, it's the exact same thing. It doesn't matter how big the show is. The process is identical no matter where you're doing. It's exactly so. If you're doing it in a small indie film, or whether you're doing it on a big TV show, now the personalities get bigger when the stakes are higher. I did Star Trek, and believe me, the first time that I went and I met with Patrick Stewart, Jean-Luc Picard, who had been playing Jean-Luc Picard since I was in high school.
Wow, that's deep in itself.
Yeah, and it's intimidating. And I'm like, and then you walk in and you're like, oh, there's Patrick Stewart, and I'm shaking his hand, and now I'm directing Patrick Stewart. And the first time that I gave Patrick Stewart a note, it was me walking from the monitor, and I'm like, I'm about to go give Patrick Stewart a note, and I'm a guy from the projects. I don't know what I'm going to say to Sir Patrick. I'm like, why is this guy going to even listen to me? But if you trust that you have if you've honed your craft and you've prepared, because the prep is everything before you start shooting. If you prep well and you've honed your craft over the years, it's like riding a bike. All of a sudden it all makes sense. And the script that you're shooting. So you come in, and I'm like, and he never wanted to be called Sir Patrick. He was just Patrick. And then you go, and I went to Patrick and I said, hey, Patrick, I think that, and I forget the note, and I gave him the note, and he's British, and he was like, oh, brilliant. Then I'm like, okay, is he messing with me? He did the take, and I said cut, and he came over and he's like, great note, I love that. And at that point, like we became buds, because what he saw was I was prepared, because all during prep I was like just hyper uber prepared about, this is the episode that I'm making, this is what Captain Picard is going through. And so there wasn't a question that he asked that I didn't know the answer to in some way. And if I didn't quite have the answer, the easiest thing you can do is say, I don't know. Like, that's a great question. What do you think? Because usually when they're asking a question, even Patrick Stewart down to a new actor, they usually have an answer. They usually have I think I know what I want to do. So as directors, if we don't have the answer, we just go, well, what do you think? And let them tell you. Right. And then the easiest thing to do is let's try that. Because now you've bought yourself some time, because by the time you walk back to your monitor and you sit down and you say action, you're now processing the idea and you're watching what they're going to do. And then now you're like, oh, yeah. And then you can go back and so it just the process sort of feeds on itself, and then it just grows and it becomes this amazing thing. The same thing happened with, whatever. Like I did Snowpiercer, and I came in and I'm meeting Daveed Diggs, and I'm like, hello, Hamilton. Like, what am I doing working with Queen? And I'm like, could not have been nicer. And at the end of the day, as big a stars as they are, they're just actors, and they want to know as a director that you're taking care of them and that you're prepared, and that's it. Like, at the end of the day, it's just director, actor. So it director, DP, director, production designer. And the thing about being a director is that we don't actually do anything. Is the secret, a dirty little secret. We're jack of all trades. What we get paid for is not to go and hang up a thing or put up a light or push a dolly. That's not what we get paid for. What we get paid for is to interpret the material and be able to articulate what's in our brain to other people. And if you can articulate and say, here's what I see, and I think it's this and it's this and it's this, and you can give an actor something active to play, or you can give the DP a mood that you want, or you give the dolly grip, the exact cue when to start pushing. That's all they want to know. And then let them do their work, and then they will give you what you want. Where directors get into trouble is when they don't know what to say, when they can't. Like, I've seen directors, because I've been a producing director now on a number of shows, and I've seen directors, and the ones that don't do well are the ones that you get on there and they're like, and they're hemming and hawing. And that's where because then people smell blood.
Now, let me ask you, even on your level, there's directors like that?
Oh, sure.
Wow,
Like, there are how do I put this? There are directors that have coasted for years. And what happens is they have amassed a number of credits. And so what happens in the studio and network level is they don't look at your work. They'll look at your credits. And so an executive looks at it and says, wow, look at all the credits this person has done.
Okay.
And then you get
Gotcha.
hired. So like
Okay.
I did, just as an example, I did a show for Amazon, and I was on set, and I realized that a shot that I was doing was a shot that was in the reel that I asked my agents to send them. Like I was literally like, it didn't occur to me that I was redoing a shot, and I was like, and I turned to the back row, because in TV you get a back row. In movies, there's no back row. In TV, there's a back row, which is all the executives and everybody, and you can't move on. In television, it's a writer's medium, so there's a writer behind you. So when I say cut, I go like this. What do you think? And then the writer goes, I love it, and then you move on. In a movie, you say cut, and it's me, and I move on. So
Right.
that's the difference. So then I did a shot, and I turned to the back row, and I said, oh, you know what? That's very similar to the shot and the thing that I sent you guys before I got this job. And they said, no, yeah, we didn't look at your reel. And I was like, what, really? And then they go, no. And I go, then why'd you hire me? And I go, oh, we loved your credits. You've done a lot. So like, I put all this work into crafting the stuff, and so many times people don't even look at it. They just want to see like, okay, you've done a lot of stuff. Good. Like it's like, that's just the reality of a lot of this stuff. I watched stuff when I was a producing director. I loved watching other directors' stuff. So I made it to me, it was a joy. You know, when I would get a submission from an agent, I would watch the episode, and I would make notes, and I would look for little indicators that directors were good at their craft. You know, and there's a number of ways that I would do it, which is a whole other podcast, but that we could do. But
I just want our audience to hear these things. You're giving so many lessons. Thank you so much.
Good.
So many lessons. I'm stuck. I'm like, oh, thank you so much.
Good.
Now you did mention diversity a little bit. Now, when I asked you, what do you feel and hear when I ask you diversity in our profession? What do we need more of?
Well, I look, when I came into the industry 30 years ago, I'm an old guy. It was a very different industry, right? It was largely Caucasian directors, male, right? Very few Latinos, very few Black directors, very few female directors. Like it was just like they existed. They were there. It wasn't like they weren't there, but it was a really, really small percentage. And while the percentage is still small to this day, and it is, I've been around long enough to have seen it. It's growing. And so what is happening, and I find really encouraging, and this is for everybody that's watching this, the industry has changed like substantially. And every show that I've ever worked on, there's always it's not just, well, let's hire X, Y, and Z directors. There is a appetite and a desire to look for different voices, right? So I have seen it in my own shows where, like, for instance, if we do 10 episodes of a show, right? What I'll tell my male directors is, you're not competing for 10 episodes, you're competing for 5. And when I tell my female directors, you're not competing for 10 episodes, you're competing for 5, because it's going to be half female, half male. Now, within those half female, half males, that starts to get broken up. So in that group, there's going to be Latino, there's going to be Black, there's going to be Asian, there's going to be Caucasian. Same thing with the women. That is completely new. That is something that it's really been going on, I would say, less than 10 years, where there's been this absolute appetite for new voices. So in terms of diverse directors, be it Latino, Black, Asian, gay, whatever, there has never been a better time to go into the industry. Because now, the caveat and the asterisk to this is it's not enough to just say, I'm Latino, hire me, right? Because what happens is, just like me, there are going to be 30 other Latino directors coming in, vying for that same slot. So let's just say it's 5 episodes for men, right?
Okay.
And so they go, we want to hire a Latino for this episode. Let's just say the studio says, for this episode, we want to hire a Latino. Great. Lovely. So now it's me and, 25 of, a lot of them are my friends, right?
Right.
So now suddenly, if everyone that is competing for the job is Latino and everyone is diverse, that means no one is diverse. So now what are you looking at? If everyone is Latino looking for that job, what are they looking at? They're looking at the work. They're looking at, like, let me see. Okay, because now we've got these great candidates. So now we've got to look at their stuff and say, who in this list do we think can kill this episode? And then, so they'll get rid of whatever 10 because they haven't done this kind of show. Like, so for instance, there's a show that I did called Evil on Paramount Plus, which is a great show. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a really, like, I've got an episode that airs. I don't know when this podcast is going to drop.
Look, you got my foot tapping under the table. Like, that's me and my husband's favorite show.
Oh my, yeah. So a couple weeks is my episode. I don't know when your podcast drops, but a couple weeks from when we were recording this.
Okay.
But I could see the Kings, Michelle and Robert King, who run the show. If they have to look at directors, right? The director's about, I mean, the series is about the supernatural. There's a little bit of the paranormal. There's a healthy amount of visual effects. There's a tone, and you've seen the show, so it's a very scary, eerie show. But there's also a lot of humor in the show. The show is funny at times. They want to hire directors that understand that tone. So now suddenly, and by the way, so now imagine now there's 20 Latino directors and they got this one slot and they want to hire Latinos. So now they're like, okay, let's get rid of these 10 because these 10 haven't done tonally what we want. So now we're down to 10. So now let's look at these 10. Well, these 5 don't have the kind of experience that I want. So now it's down to 5. And now they got to break it down. They got to watch this. They got to watch the episodes, or they got to look at the credits, or they got to do this. They got to meet you, and then you got to stay for your supper and like tell them it's a job interview, like why it is that you want, that you're the perfect guy for the job.
Right.
And I did that, for instance, on From Dusk Till Dawn, right? I did for Robert Rodriguez, and when I went to go do that show, I had never done horror in my life.
Really?
Ever. I had done Spanish language TV. I had done family stuff, and this is a true story. So a friend of mine was a producer on the show, and he said to me, he goes, "I want you to meet Robert because I think you'd be good." And I said to him, "Well, I've never done horror." And he goes, "Yeah, but I like what you do with the camera and all that. I think you'd be good. So I'm gonna I'll help you. Like, I'll set up an interview with Robert, and then you're on your own, right?" So this was way back in the days. There wasn't even a Zoom. It was like Skype. This is how far back this was. I was in LA and Robert was in Austin. And I get on the Skype with Robert, and Robert's a very nice guy. And Robert is looking, he's like talking to me and looking at my resume while talking to me. He's like, "So yeah, Joe, yeah, you've done a lot of kid stuff and a lot of Spanish language stuff. You haven't done horror." And then I just kind of said, as a joke, I just said, "Well, Robert, you've done Sin City and Spy Kids. Like, you ought to know that you can go back and forth between different genres." And I was like, all of a sudden, I'm like, "Oh my God, why did I say that? That's not a good joke." Like, I was trying to make a joke, but then he thought about it. And he's like, "You know what? You're right." And so at that point, he started talking to me director to director. And then what he started doing is he started grilling me about the episode, one episode. And he was grilling me about it. And he was asking me questions. And what would you do here? And how would you shoot this? And so I just kind of did and I focused on characters, because if you focus on characters, then everything else will sort itself out. Like, I knew, K&B was going to do all the creature effects, which is Greg Nicotero's company. I knew all the creature effects were going to be awesome. Robert's company was doing the visual effects, so I knew that was going to be awesome. So I said, I'm going to focus on characters, and I talked about characters, and then but I didn't know if I was going to get the job, and it was like seriously like 3 meetings where I was like being put through a gauntlet to get this one episode, and I finally get the call, I get the job. I'm now shooting the show, and we're like 3 days into the shoot. I know I'm not going to get fired because there's always the like, am I going to get fired from this? Whatever. So, 3 days in, I'm pretty confident. Like I had heard from Miramax that like they liked the daily, so I'm like, okay, I think I'm good. And Robert was always hanging around the set because we were shooting in his studio in Austin. And he comes by, and I finally was like, all right, Robert, you got to tell me, like, why did you give me the job? Because by that point, I had heard of other directors that had been up for the same episode, but yet I got it, and not those other guys. And these guys were like horror directors that had done horror their entire lives. I'm like, why did you pick me instead of these horror directors? And he said, because you focused on character. You weren't, because the horror directors were like, okay, it's talky, ooh, gore, horror. Then that's what they liked. I went the other way, and I focused on character. In television, especially, it's character. And so he said, I knew that you were going to take care of the characters, and obviously you've got a good visual sense. That I knew that your set pieces were going to be good. And from that point on, I did a number of episodes from Dusk Till Dawn, and I even did the series finale. I did the last episodes of the series. So, that was, so that ended up working out. But it started with the fact that I had to audition for it. So there's no one way to get the job. In Robert's case, I had to audition, and I had to go through a number of meetings. You also get to a point in your career when you have a number of credits where people just hire you off of credits. There's also a point that you're going to have to do a little, like the movie I'm doing right now. I had to do a little audition for it, and I had to not audition, a presentation. I did where I basically set up how I would do the movie, and so there's no one way to get the job, but however it is, once you get your foot in the door, get that job. And all that you could do is focus on how you would do it, and don't worry too much about like, I wonder what they want me to say here. Just go, this is how I see it.
Oh, can you say that again? Focus on what?
Focus on how you would do it, because if you try to hyper focus on like, what do I think they want, then you're not going to be doing what ultimately you're going to have to do, which is what's in your brain. You're going to have to articulate it to everyone. So I always stick to like, this is what I would do. This is how I would do it. This is what I would do. This is how I would do it. And you stick to that. And if it lines up with what they're doing, great, then you get the job. If it doesn't line up, then that's okay. You move on, you say, thank you very much. And you move on and, off to the next one. But by and large, I've been very fortunate because the things that I wanted to do, I've been able to fortunately line up with what other people have wanted. But it's also a lot of reading between the lines. Like the last thing I'll say about Evil is the Kings give you a cheat sheet with their script. The scripts are very specific, right? I've never had a script given to me by a showrunner where they wrote in the description, like, it's like, and then it says that David walks in and does whatever. And then in the description, they wrote, hey, Joe, here, make sure that you get us a blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I'm reading it in the script, a note from the showrunner to me, the director. And so all you got to do is do the thing that Robert and Michelle are asking you for. And where directors get in trouble is where they're like, I'm the director. I'm going to do the thing that's in my head. And when you're doing television, you're there to serve. You're there to serve a writer. When you're doing a movie, that's something different. When it's a movie, it's something different. But when you're doing a television show, you serve the writer, you serve the showrunner. And it's not your job to come in and you go, excuse me, showrunner, let me tell you how to do your show. No, the idea is you want a USB connect to the showrunner's brain and go download, give me what you want. And then your job is to go. And then once you understand what he or she wants in television, then that's where you can create your stuff. That's where you can express yourself, because now you know what the parameters are. You know exactly what it is that they want. And then now, so what would happen is in those parameters, then I could pitch things and I could say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, and I'm thinking of doing this, and they're like, love it, love it. Why? Because I'm not coloring outside the lines. I'm staying right in what they want.
Wow.
But I'm
Okay.
able to do stuff creatively that's fulfilling for me as a filmmaker within their world. And those rules might not apply on the next show. It might just be specific to the show, and that's okay. But
Okay.
it's like, but it's just learning what the showrunner runs. Anyway, I'm all over the place. But
So it's beautiful. So you have so much experience. Like, do you have a favorite genre, or a favorite project you've done? What's your favorite project?
I have to say, Star Trek Picard was like one of the, because I love all that sort of scopy action, spectacle kind of stuff. I, like Evo, I love Snowpiercer. I did Quantum Leap, as well. Like, I'm doing a movie now for Paramount Plus called Henry Danger, the movie, which is based on a Nickelodeon TV show.
Yes,
And
sir.
it's like a big superhero kind of thing. And I love all that kind of stuff. I love like I grew up in the 80s, like in the era of Amblin and Steven Spielberg. And I was a Star Wars nerd. So
Star
for me,
Wars.
I love all that stuff. Like like a lot of the filmmakers that you've had on are really, really good storytellers that are telling really important stories. And I always, and like every time I hear it, I always like, God, I'm nowhere near as good as these guys. God, because they're like, like I feel like I need to tell my like important story, but I'm like busy doing like the silly stuff. I'm like, like I actually get a little intimidated by directors that tell really sort of important, grounded stories because I haven't done that yet, and I feel like I'm a bit of a coward. I'm like, oh God, I haven't done that kind of stuff. I should do that. I should do that before my career's over.
Man, you're doing great. You're going to teach so many people. I think more than children, you guys are going to teach. You guys are teaching grown folks, what to do. I also wanted to ask you, what's some advice that you really think a young person, incoming filmmaker, should know?
I think I wish something that somebody had told me is branding. Branding is key to everything. So when I started, this was in the early 90s, what was big during that time was what I called guys with guns movies, right?
Okay.
And it was like in the era of Tarantino, and it was in the era of indie movies, and there were always guys with guns, and they were aiming it at the lens, and they were like, and it was like a ton of those kinds of movies.
Yes.
And I enjoyed, like, I'm a guy, I enjoyed watching those movies, but that wasn't my thing. Like, that wasn't the kinds of stories I want to tell. Like I just said, I want to talk, I like Amblin and 1980s kind of like fun kind of movies.
Right.
But I'm like, well, this is the trend and this is what everybody's doing. So I might as well. So I did a couple of movies that were guys with guns movies. They were fine. Those movies were fine, but like they weren't me as a filmmaker. And then I did Spanish language television for a long time. And that's fine. But I don't watch Spanish language television, but I was doing Spanish language television. And so what ended up happening is, going back to Robert, when I did From Dusk Till Dawn, swear to God, and I told my wife this, it was the first time that I had done a show that I would watch personally in my career.
That says a lot.
I was like, I can't believe this is the first show that I've worked on that I would watch on my own, even if I hadn't worked on it. And it was like the light switch turned on, because when you work on something that is in your brand, that is your brand, that is the way that you are. Like, you asked me earlier, what kinds of things do I like? And I told you, like I like scopy special effects, kind of fantasy, science fiction, kind of, I like Star Trek. That's my brand. I'm not saying it's the correct brand. I'm not saying it's better than any other brand, but that's my brand. So as a filmmaker, like I'll give you another brief story. I was mentoring another filmmaker, and he said, and I hadn't seen his stuff yet, and he said like, oh, I'm a comedy director, and I was like, all right, cool. Send me your stuff. I'll take a look at it, and we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about your trajectory and all that. So he sent me his films, and I watched his films. And I think he sent me like 3 shorts. None of them were comedies. All 3 of them were like weird dramas, and like they were like very experimental. And I'm like, am I missing the comedy here? I'm like, no, this is not comedy. I don't understand it. And so I get on the Zoom with the guy, and I was like, yeah, dude, I didn't see any comedy in anything. He's like, oh yeah, no, I haven't done any comedies yet. I just want to be a comedy director. And I was like, buddy, if you're going to call yourself a comedy director, you better show somebody a comedy, right? So this is a long-winded way of saying, it's okay to be put in a box. So if you like movies that are period costume pieces, I'm making this up, and you like those kinds of things, like you like Bridgerton, I'm making this up, and you like those kind of things, and you're like, oh, I love Bridgerton. That's the kind of film, that's the kind of show I want to work on. Well, then when you make your film, it better be a period costume drama, because what's going to happen is the work that you put forward and you say, here's my film, that is how you're being labeled. Even before you're labeled as a Latino or a Black filmmaker, the first thing that speaks about who you are is the film itself, is the work, because it goes beyond our identity, and it goes to what kind of filmmaker you are. What are you good at? How do you craft the story? Like because when you're telling a story in a genre that you love, it oozes through every frame. Every frame you could tell, oh my God, yeah, he clearly loves this genre. So, and then stick to it, because I know that sometimes as directors, we want to tell different kinds of stories, right? Early on in your career, it's okay to say, I want to do the period costume drama, and do 2 or 3 of those in a row. Because do you know what that makes you? It makes you employable, because it makes you, whereas when that's your brand. And if that's what you're doing, and you've made 2 or 3 of those kinds of movies, and you're like, God, I'm sick of doing period costume dramas, and you're successful, then you can branch out and tell a different kind of story later. But get to a point. Don't let someone else tell you who what you are. You tell them, this is who I am. And when you go, I like drama, they better see drama. If you say comedy, you better have a comedy. If you like sci-fi, you better show them a sci-fi. And then that's how you push yourself. And then once you're successful, you could branch out, because now, like, I'm doing other kinds of shows that aren't just the scopy kinds of shows, because now I've shown, like, oh, I could do that. Oh, then he can also do this. But it takes a second to get to that. But branding, know your brand, and that's what you stick, and that's what you tell people that you are. And it's about the work, and it's not, because the thing about us as people and who we are as filmmakers, that's a big part of the job, right? Because people want to know who they're dealing with. People want to know, hey, I'm going to spend 12 hours a day with this person, 14 hours a day with this person. I want to know that this person is a good individual. I want to know this person's story.
Right.
That's really relevant. The key thing is going to be, does this person know how to tell this kind of story? And it's the work. So that's the key to the whole thing, I think.
Okay. Wow, Joe, please come back.
Of course.
I'm offering you an invitation for a part 2. Wow. I'm blown away. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Joe Menendez, guys, Black Filmmakers Matter. His website is scrolling down at the bottom, www.joemenendez.com. Guys, please listen to these filmmakers. They are wonderful. Joe, thanks again. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.